Okay, vineyard site selection for Maryland's diverse regions. As I mentioned earlier, we have a very, very diverse state, and this is where you have to start putting your mind to it. Everyone here obviously is from a different area, different county, different town. The climate you have, the mesoclimate you have in your potential vineyard area, the soil you have is unique to you. So everything we talk about today, you have to figure out where you fit in this and how, whether it's beneficial, whether it's going to be a limitation, and work towards it. I start out all my viticulture presentation with this slide because to me it best depicts the axiom that the best way to make a great wine is to grow great grapes, because the wine is made in the vineyard. It's easy to make a great wine from great grapes and impossible to make a great wine from poor quality grapes. So it all starts in the vineyard, and to get great grapes you need to start ground one with a good site that's good for growing grapes. Our number one goal, the wine's made in the vineyard, fully ripened varietal character grapes each year in the vineyard, as pest-free as possible. That's our goal, and when we put everything together, we can make this work. Most important thing, location, location, location. The quickest way to get into the grape quality production is the slow way. I'll get calls in February, March, and April of growers who call and say, oh, I hear the wine industry is growing in the state, I want to plant grapes this year. And that's not a good way to start, because most of the people who do that do not prepare the soil well, do they not evaluate their site well, they take whatever varieties the nursery will give them, and they usually end up getting into more problems than anything. So take your time, plan a year ahead, 2 years ahead, do it the slow way, start slow, start small, and then once you take the bumps and bruises, then learn from that, and then you can grow from there. When you have your location set up, when you have your variety set up, and when you have your markets set up. There's this concept in grape growing and winemaking throughout the world, which the French have kind of initiated, called terroir. And basically this is my definition: creating a wine that represents the soil and the climate, where it is grown, and the hands of the person that made it. So your site is unique. The wine that you make in your site is unique because of where you grow the grapes, because of the climate and that mesoclimate in your area, the soils that you're dealing with, and the soil drainage and the hydrology, and then the way you handle those grapes in the winery. This is a huge part, and this is, people say, well, this is Maryland, how can we compare to Bordeaux, Burgundy, and California? People live in Maryland, people come to Maryland to buy Maryland wines, and they want wines that reflect the local effort, that reflect the local agriculture, and they really enjoy doing that. Again, less than 3% of the wines sold in Maryland are Maryland wines, so there's a lot of area for growth. There's a significant part of the market, and people looking for Maryland wines that reflect our terroir, and they pay a premium price for it. People are paying $60, $70, $80 for bottles of wine in Maryland, and when you compare that to wines that they can buy in a liquor store, it may not be the best balance. So it shows that people are paying premium prices for local grown grapes and fruit, and that's a good thing for us. Primary consideration: frequency of low temperature extremes inducing crop or vine damage. The biggest limitation to growing grapes in the eastern United States is cold winters. There's this rule, and you can write this down: the grapevine has to be alive to produce grapes. Okay, there we got that one. Very basic one. As long as the vine's alive, it can produce grapes. If it doesn't produce very good grapes. The grapevines are sensitive to cold. When we have cold temperatures in the winter that start getting below zero, depending on where you are, if you get to -5, you start getting damage to the crop. You start getting to -8, -10, you have more damage to the crop, and now possibly damage to the vines. You get down to -15, you may kill the vines outright, and all your money in the establishment is gone. Sometimes the vines can come back, sometimes they don't, but this is your biggest limiting factor: knowing your minimum temperatures that you get. How many times in a 10-year period do you get below zero, or do you get to -5? That's going to be your limiting factor for consistent production at your site. So we'll look into that and see all the different effects. All these work together to show you the survival of the vines and the quality of grapes. So we'll go through each one of these independently here. These are the macroclimate considerations. We have the basic regions of Maryland, the western mountain regions. The limitation here, of course, is cold winters. We have areas in Out in Western Maryland, in Garrett County, where they can get minus 20, minus 25 degrees, and vinifera grapes, Chardonnay, Cabernet, will not survive those conditions. 20 years ago, when we first started these presentations, we basically said, you're in a difficult situation. There's not many grapes where you can grow out there, but there has been a program in Minnesota and some other areas in the north producing hybrids that are cold hardy. So we can actually pretty carefully now and consistently grow grapes in Western Maryland where they have reached minus 25, minus 30 degrees. The grapes can tolerate those. It's not Cabernet Sauvignon, it's not Chardonnay, but there are grapes that survive those temperatures and make pretty decent wine quality. So even out here now we have the potential. This is our classic grape growing area. When I say classic, typical what we've seen in the old world in France and Italy and Spain and those areas, usually somewhere between 400 to 1,000 feet elevation. So you have a little bit of slope to work with, a little bit of elevation and slope and aspect to work with. But a huge point of our industry these days is in Southern Maryland and Eastern Shore. Not the prime, not the typical grape growing areas, but they do have the advantage where very rarely, because of the moderating effect of the ocean and the bay, very rarely are they getting the minus temperatures, below zero temperatures. So the cold risk out here and the risk to vine damage is much less than we deal with up in this area. Problem here is you have warm days and warm nights, and that's not the best for growing quality grapes. Becomes a little bit more challenging, but again, we have varieties that we've studied over the years that can produce good quality wines, and we've had Governor's Cup winners coming from all over the state, so there's no real limitation to saying we can't produce a premium wine out here. We have wines that have won the Governor's Cup from the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland. So it can be done anywhere in the state as long as you know your site and have match the cultivar properly. So you have your macroclimate, which is the region where you are. And again, the critical thing here is the minimum winter temperatures that you're dealing with. And all of these are important. The length of the growing season. This means how long it takes for grapes to ripen. Different cultivars of grapes have longer periods. Pinot Noir may be 140 days to ripening. Pinot Gris, same type of thing, whereas Zinfandel may be 210 days of ripening. So different cultivars, and again, we'll show you this throughout the year or throughout the day today. Different cultivars take different times to ripen and ripen in different times of the year. So therefore, you have to know the length of your growing season to make sure the grapes you're growing in that area fully ripen each year. Not only are they fully ripened, but the vines get more time to acclimate afterwards to make sure they survive and get through the winter. So somewhere between 165 and 200 days is where most of our season is. Not typically a limiting factor in most areas except in the western part of the state. Here again is the critical one, the frequency of low temperature extremes. How often you get to zero, how often you get to -5, and how often you get to -10. If you're in a situation where you're getting -10 one or two times in 10 years, you probably do not want to put a high percentage of vinifera grapes in there. And we'll talk about the type of grapes throughout the day, so just so you're aware of that. I'm not saying if you get this cold you can't grow grapes, it's just the cultivar choice is going to be really critical there. We have vinifera grapes, we have hybrid grapes, and we have American grapes, and they get increasingly cold hardy. The vinifera is the most sensitive, the hybrids are less sensitive, and the Americans are the most cold tolerant. So they get more cold tolerant, but the demand and the wine quality is in the opposite direction. We'll talk about that in more detail. The other thing, and this is becoming more of a problem it seems these days with climate change, the frequency of drought or excessive rains, the frequency of both of these seems to be increasing these days, although within the state, the geography and the geology of the state is that if you're in certain areas of the state just naturally get more rain than other areas. I'm in southern Washington County, as you saw before. If you just go south of us in Loudoun County, they get typically about 10% more rain than we do, and we're only about 15 air miles away. So when the storms come in, they tend to break, they divide and go north into Hagerstown and south into Loudoun County, and southern part of our county is usually spared. So there are these rain shadows and situations like that where certain areas just have different macroclimates. They get a little bit different rainfall and a little bit different temperature extremes. So if you're in one of those, that could be an advantage or a disadvantage. So you just have to know where you are, and there's always lots of extremes that we deal with. This guy got away with this on ABC News in the weather report, talking about the storm was coming and relating it not only to how many inches of snow, but how many bottles of wine you're going to need to survive until the snow goes away. So got to look at it in a fun standpoint. This is a plant hardiness zone map. As you see, this is Maryland in here, and we have Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Virginia down here. Basically, it looks like it's hard to figure, but basically what we're looking at, as you change colors going from west to east, for every change of color, the minimum winter temperature goes down 5 degrees, or coming from here, as you go this direction, the minimum goes up this way or goes down this way. So from the tip of Garrett County to the tip of Accomack here, there's 25 degrees difference in minimum winter temperatures. So this is really the bottom line in knowing where you are and what kind of winter temperatures you're going to be experiencing. And you see we have major large areas where we're very rarely below zero, and that's a good thing. Critical thing is where you're up here and sit in this Piedmont to mountainous area, in a very small distance. In this area, maybe 15, 20 miles, you can go through 3 hardiness zones. So if you're here in the middle of Carroll County, you're typical from that area, you go 15 miles to the east, and your conditions are similar to, the winter conditions are similar to the eastern shore in southern Maryland because of the little bit of a moderating effect of the Chesapeake. You go a little bit to the west, and now you have the same conditions as they have in Pittsburgh. So within a short distance here, you could have 15 degrees difference in the minimum winter temperature. So you need to know your site very specifically of where you are. Same when you get out to this area, you cross things. So look closely at this. Over here, not as much difference. Again, gets a little bit different throughout the winter, but critical thing is in these areas, knowing exactly where you are. Look closely in your particular mesoclimate in comparison and see how it fits to make sure you're in the better areas, and if you're not, adjust your cultivars. This is the new hardiness zone map. They moderated a little bit. The colors are a little bit easier to read, but sometimes harder to see the difference. But we're still seeing the same thing up in here. You still see these little grooves in here where we're changing the color. So even though the map has changed a little bit, we're still seeing the same range of changes of minimum temperatures up in these areas. So know your site very well. And there's tons of data out there with all the different sites we have, and with the internet you can look at your weather data for the minimum temperatures you've had over the last 25 years, the average minimum temperatures, and the extremes. The extremes, of course, are more important. An average low temperature doesn't kill a grapevine. The extreme minimum temperature is usually the one. So whether you're in southern Maryland or eastern shore, there's data there with your record lows and your frequency of receiving cold days and how often it happens throughout the year. Also, the higher temperatures you can get through that, also what you're dealing with in the summer. So I keep mentioning cold hardiness and how the vines can have problems and have to survive. And not only do they have to survive the winter, there's 5 different ways that the winter can cause damage to the vines. And again, you need to evaluate your site for all of these. One is fall acclimation, when the vines have been harvested, and then the wood is hardening in the canes, and whether you start having early frosts or not, whether that vine has a chance to store all its carbohydrates for the winter so it can survive the winter after all the production throughout the year. So that's a critical phase, typically not a problem with most locations in Maryland. Here is our big ones, the minimum temperature tolerance. I've talked about this many times, whether it's single or multiple events, the minimum temperature that you get in typically over a 10-year period, and the frequency of those in your location. Another big one we really deal with, especially as you move east in Maryland, is this fluctuating temperature tolerance. Grapevines can tolerate, again, down to 0 degrees pretty much frequently, but this time of year when we start having 50, 60, 65 degree days, the vines start thinking it's getting closer to summer and closer to spring, and they start coming out of dormancy. So instead of being able to tolerate 0 or -5 degrees, a few days of 60 degrees, now they will only tolerate +5 or 0. So as the vines start deacclimating and coming out of their hardiness, that spike from a 60-degree day to a single-digit night over a couple days can be very damaging, especially in the late February through mid-March period when we're dealing with this. Most of the time with us, it's usually in late January where we'll have a little thaw. In mid-January, we'll get up to 50, and then we'll get down in the teens or single digits. That's when a lot of the damage takes place with this. And again, a good site will help with minimizing that.
Joe, question, sorry.
Sure.
Is there a difference from your research or just general knowledge that's been gained over, of course, time, that minimum threshold, whether it goes to -5 degrees for one day for a period of 5 hours or 12 hours, and the vine's holding longer in comparison where it's like 3 days of more consistent, like 0?
Yeah, and it's a lot of it depends on when it happens. If it's the end of December, early January, that's when vines are at their cold hardiness. If you can go down to 0 and stay there for multiple days, and you will be fine. Sometimes they can even take a spike down to -8 or something, as long as it's for an hour or two, and come back out of it. They can tolerate that. When you get -10 for 8 hours through an evening, that's typically when we're having that. And that depends on the site, that depends on the time of year when it's happening, how cold hardy the vines are at that time, and the specific cultivars. There are some cultivars that can tolerate that and some that are not. So there's lots of variables in there, but yes, the lower the temperature and definitely the longer the duration. The duration is a real critical one. They can usually take short blurbs for a short period of time. Usually right around 6 a.m. is our coldest time of the night. Usually there's a little spike there, but as long as it spikes for an hour or two and comes back, most of the vines, it'll kill a percentage maybe of the buds, but not enough. I mean, we prune away 99% of the buds on a grapevine, and when we're pruning, so you can kill 80% of the buds and still have your 10% that you need for a crop that year. So yes, and even within the vine, the buds closer to the cordon are more cold hardy than the ones up here. So these might be able to take +5 and die. These might be able to take -5. So lots of variables there. But good question. Okay, deacclimation is kind of like the fluctuating temperatures as we start coming out of this, as we get in in just February and March, and we start getting the warmer weather. Some cultivars really come out of the cold hardiness quickly and can get hammered if we get cold again, and you don't have to get as cold at that point. And then some varieties break bud early. Chardonnay is one of the classic ones where they'll start growing early. The vines will come out, be very sensitive. We'll get a light frost. Even if you get down to 28 degrees, you can fry the bud. Now the good news for grapevines, we have a triple bud. You have a primary that grows, that comes out first. That's your biggest bud. You get a full crop from that. If that one's killed, there's a secondary bud in there, comes out after that. It's a little more cold hardy, produces somewhere between no fruit and 30% of a crop, the secondary buds. And then if and when that one gets killed, there's a tertiary bud that is last mode survival. It's just a vegetative bud that helps to keep the vine alive. So we have a little bit of insurance built within the vine to help you with that. And you can see, you can kind of see there's the primary, secondary, and tertiary buds there. So they are in there, and you can see this is alive. They're all green there, and these were all killed from the cold event. So whether any of these can cause this to happen, you see here not only is the buds killed here, but we've actually had some damage to the phloem and the conductive tissue, the xylem there, which will cause long-term damage. Even if the bud's alive, that may actually kill the vine. Some of the other things we deal with, not as critical, are the summer temperatures and the length of the growing season. That's going to influence the disease reaction. It's going to influence the wine or the grape and wine quality. So basically, again, from far western Maryland all the way through to southern Maryland, we may have anything from less to 2,500 growing degree days all the way up to 4,000 growing degree days. So here we can ripen any cultivar grape that we know pretty well. Out here, very, very limiting. You're not going to grow Cabernet Sauvignon, you're not going to grow Zinfandel late season varieties out here. So we have a lot of good information. We have regional variety recommendations of what fits in different areas because of the cold hardiness and because of the ripening season, but you just need to know your area. And of course, there are the things that happen within that aren't the climate, but the weather. We have these individual hurricanes that come and other events that can then raise havoc no matter what time of year it is, no matter what your site is. So beware of those, not much we can do. One of the reasons for this is most of these take place in September and October, so some of the earlier season varieties can help you avoid hurricanes and the huge amount of moisture that comes in a short period of time with those. So again, lots of storm impact to grapes. I like this one here. These people should hit the liquor stores. These people buy a boat. You just need to know what's coming up. We can plan for the major events that are predictable, but we're going to have the unpredictable ones, and you just have to learn to go with the flow. Okay, now is the time for you to know specifically your macroclimate. Now is where the critical thing comes in for growing grapes, and that's the mesoclimate. That's your specific location in your vineyard, what makes it unique as far as risks or lack of risk of late frost, the slope, any moderating effect of body water, lots of things that can make your mesoclimate better or worse than the macroclimate where you are. This is a picture of the Finger Lakes up in New York State. Vineyards right down here on the Finger Lakes. These lakes are 500 and 600 feet deep. They greatly modify the local climate or local weather there. Very rarely gets super cold there because these hardly ever freeze, and as long as they're not frozen, the temperature can moderate all around in these vineyard areas. And in the summer, it tends not to be as hot in these areas again because the water takes longer to warm up and takes more time to cool down. So if you're close to a large body of water, Chesapeake or the Atlantic, you're going to have less extremes of temperatures, high temperatures in the summer, and less extremes of cold temperatures in the winter, which is usually desirable, what we're looking for. Topography is a huge one, especially when you're in the northern counties. The degree of slope affects the air movement and the water movement. Both of these are super critical for cold hardiness and for wine quality. And again, now we're talking about these regions. When here, not a whole lot you're worried about with slope and aspect. If you're 50 feet above sea level, and these they tease me down here at 50 feet, you actually start getting nosebleeds for Southern Maryland. You're actually that high relative elevation. In this area, we could be 300, 400, 500, 700 feet above sea level, and this area you can get as high as 2,000 to 3,000 feet above sea level. And these can be very critical in minimizing the fluctuations. Elevation is the single most important vineyard feature in the Mid-Atlantic region. It impacts the low temperature extremes and the length of the growing season. And so we look to find the best sites that fit in there because we want to minimize the risk. We can never eliminate them, we want to minimize them. So why is this elevation important? Cold air is heavier than warm air. So when we have these cold periods, the cold air is heavier. It moves down to the lower areas, pushes and moves the warm area up to the higher areas. So normally we think as you go increase in elevation, you get colder. But for individual events, we usually find this stratification of the air. So the cold air will go to the lowest spot. So therefore that'll be your lowest temperature. The warmer air that was here gets put out and gets moved up higher. So you'll have this cold area here, say 25 degrees. As you start moving up in elevation, you actually get this relatively warm air that's been displaced out of here. So that's why the vineyard is almost always on the side of the hill, not in the bottom or the plateau, but on the side, not at the highest part, but along this, because you have this grade from coldest temperatures to warm temperatures and then back up to the cold temperatures. So as long as there's nothing impeding, like woods or anything like that. The cold air moves down the hill, goes through the vineyard and into the lower spots, and hopefully, if you have the right site, drains away away from your vineyard and away from your site, and you minimize that. And this area is always a little bit warmer. Very, very critical thing to know this. And if you have a site, the best thing is to buy some temperature sensors, high-low thermometers, or the digital ones. You put them out there in various spots around your vineyard, whether in this spot, up in here, and down in here, and monitor your temperatures and see the range that you will deal with. Typically, we're putting our most cold-sensitive varieties at the best spot, and our more sensitive varieties in the lower spot. And we kind of develop the striations based on that. What you can do just quickly, superficially, whenever there's fog, and we have that lots this time of year, the fog tells you wherever you see the fog laying, that's going to be where your air is layering. That's where the cold pocket's going to be. So this area here and this area here where you see the fog is going to be colder than this area on the slope, because the cold air is ponding here, the cold air is ponding here and moving away. So very quick evaluation you can do, just looking where the air movement is and where the fog is settling on some of these spring mornings will give you a good clue towards that. But the best thing, again, put some temperature sensors here, put some temperature sensors here and up here, and you'll see the range of temperatures that you're dealing with. 3 to 5 degrees can be the difference between having a full crop and possibly even no crop or even dead vines in a specific location. So it's very, very huge to be able to do that. Other things that will also influence is the aspect of the slope, and that aspect means the direction your slope is facing, north, south, east, or west. Why is that important? Because it affects the vine physiology. Basically, the sun comes up in the east, goes across the southern sky, and sets in the west. So if you're in the north, you're getting very little direct sun. If your slope is facing north, you're getting very little direct sun because your sun is going from the east to the west and facing the southern sky. So for spring bud break, if you have varieties that break bud early, you want to put those on your northern slope, because lack of direct sunlight will retard the bud break and you won't have the problem with the early frost. If you have a direct south or southwest, you're going to get the most sunlight. It's going to advance your bud break and you're going to have more trouble with late season or with early frost. As far as diseases are concerned, we want to try to dry out. Every night in the summer we have dew on the vines because of our high humidity. So in the morning, the sun comes up in the morning facing the east, the southeast, that gets the first sunlight. That's where your leaves dry out the most. So that's a good thing for AM foliage drying, your east exposure. Your west, you don't get the sun until later, so it dries out more slowly, so you have more of a chance for disease there. But in the west, you have greater heat of fruit, so you usually put your red varieties out there when you're southwest slopes, because that's where you get the most sun. They get the most ripening, most hours of sun for ripeness, as opposed to your white grapes, which need less hours of sun for ripening. Okay, so this is one of the things we do. We evaluate your whole site and we pick the varieties where they're going to fit and where they're going to be from a cold standpoint and from a quality standpoint, and avoiding the problems. There are some stopgap methods we can do if you have a site that isn't the best. There are some ways when we have late frost or we have minimum temperatures, there is frost and cold mitigation things. These large fans can be put out there to blow the air. Again, when we have these inversions where you have cold air down here and warm air up here, there is these fans and these kind of things which mix the air up and bring the warm air that's up here, bring it down into the vineyard, and take the cold air and mix it up in here. And you can gain a few degrees, which again can be the difference. There are people that spend $15,000 to rent a helicopter to mix the air above their vineyard. And you figure that sounds like a lot of money, but when you're talking about grapes that are worth $2,000 a ton, and you have 50 acres of vineyards, so you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, it sometimes can pay to be worth to do something like that. The important thing is to try to avoid these kind of sites, your low spots where you may have these frost and low pockets and cold pockets by your site selection. Okay, soil plays a huge part. Climate is important, but soil is very critical, both from cold hardiness as well as wine quality standpoint. Very, very important thing over here, not only for establishment for growing grapes. Excess water is the #1 limiting factor for consistent quality grape production in the eastern U.S. It contributes to winter damage. If you have a wet site, and many southern Maryland people have a high water table, Eastern Shore, your water table comes up in the winter. Your grapevines, even though you're not getting below zero, your grapevine's roots are in the water and their cold tolerance is therefore decreased. If you have a high water table, it gets within a couple feet of your soil level. If the roots are in water, they're going to be more sensitive to cold. So you can have more damage if you have wet soils. In the summer, if you have wet soils, you're going to have excess vegetative vigor. The vines are going to grow, they're going to be out of balance, going to be more work for you, and it's going to decrease the grape quality because of the excess water allows the grapes to keep growing. And of course, when you get rains and excess water during ripening, the grapes get diluted, the flavors are diluted, and the quality is not as good. So bottom line here is if you have a deep, well-drained soil, you're going to avoid winter problems, vigor problems, and have better quality. So the soil can be a huge factor here in determining your water management and the water holding capacity. It's what you're looking for. So with the soils, we're looking for well to preferably excessively well-drained soils, the sandy type soils, the low silt soils that will give you the drainage that we're looking for, and then adequate or significant depth to groundwater or to seasonal high water table. We want to avoid that water table coming up into our vineyard root zone. And adequate depth to groundwater, again, trying to avoid any problems with the roots getting down into there. Just to give you a feel for the importance of the soil, this is one of the famous vineyards in Bordeaux. And you see right out here, you see the gravelly type soil that they're working with. This is an excessively well-drained soil. You see these vines just barely growing. They got about a foot of growth. There's not even a trellis on these because they're not vegetatively vigorous. You go up in this area here and they're on a trellis and you see how much more they're growing. There's a change in the soil series over here, much more water holding capacity. They're much more vigorous. This wine here is about $20 a bottle. This wine here is about $600 a bottle. So do you think there's much of a climate difference between here and here? Probably not. It's only 100 yards or so. So obviously the huge difference here in that wine quality and grape quality is coming from the soil. Well-drained, excessively well-drained soils here, low vigor, low problems. Here where you have higher vigor, the grape quality and the wine quality is not as good. So soils alone can be huge in influencing the quality of the wine that you're working with. So how do you find out what you have? We have the Soil Conservation Service has this nice system. In the early 1900s, they sent people around and they mapped the soil, all the soils in the United States. They went around digging little holes and they saw what the soil series was there, and they've mapped all the soils. Originally they were on paper maps and then they digitized them, and now they're all online for you to be able to search. You just you go to the site, you put your address in, and it gives you a view of it. So you can get a hard copy. It's web-based now, so you go to the soil survey, you search by address, put in your area of interest, and it gives you your soil series and descriptions. So this is, you put your address in, it gives you this overhead view, and you figure out, okay, here's the road near me, here's this place where I'm interested in. So you put in this area of interest, you draw this line on the computer, and then you just click on the center here, and you wait a couple seconds, and voila, you get your little lines here to tell you approximately, and this is not exact science obviously, but it tells you approximately based on elevation and other changes in color where your soil series are changing. Then you click on any one of these and then a little unit comes up and it tells you your 4 soils that you have in this area, the map unit name, what's the name of the soil, the area within this region, the percentage of acres, and the percentage of that area. And then you click on the specific soil, and it gives you the characteristics of it. Map unit gives you the elevation, annual precipitation, frost-free period here, type of soils, the name of the soil here, what you're dealing with, loam soil, what are the components, and then the critical thing here is drainage class. Again, here moderately well drained, capacity and limited later to transmit water. In other words, where is it going? Frequency of flooding, none. Available water capacity, very low. So these are all the characteristics that you're looking for. Again, moderately to excessively well drained, more than 80 inches to get to the seasonal high water table. All those things are good. That's the characteristics you're looking for, as opposed to switching to another type. You see here, this is the one right next to it, and this one well drained, more than 80 inches, 42 to 72 inches to the water table, no flooding. So again, there's going to be little differences depending on the slope and the elevation you're dealing with. And then you can decide, okay, this is my best drained soil here, I can put my vinifera here. These have a little problem with waterlogging here, so I maybe put my hybrids here. These are too wet, I don't plant those at all. So you can decide on your planting if you're going to plant or what varieties you're going to plant in specific areas on that. And we have not only this tool, but I'll show you in a second some additional tools we have. So once you have that general area mapped out, you then preferably you get augers or even a backhoe in, and someone who knows soils or geology, and they rip a hole or dig a trench in your area and be able to look at the different soil series that you're dealing with. So whether it's an auger hole or a pit, you can look at the rooting depth of the natural vegetation that's there. You can look for a thing called these gray lines called modeling, which shows you when your seasonal high water table comes up from underground. There's usually a line where you would see in the soil which has this kind of gray color, where there would be where the seasonal high water table is, and that would show you where your water's coming in, how much depth of soil you have before you get there. So lots of things you can show. A lot of people aren't real happy about having to dig big holes like this, but it really can tell you a lot about your transition and your soils based on those maps, and whether you do have some problems with soil water tables. The more research you do to your site, the better you can understand it and decide if you should plant it or where you should plant specific varieties. There's some other little things that are critical. Again, without digging holes, you'll see certain areas when you're walking in your field after rain. If you see standing water, you really should not be planting grapes anywhere where there's standing water after after heavy rain. You can see the ruts here from where the tractor was. Obviously, that's wet all the time. So this is what you see. You look back here, see the vines, they all look good. Down here, where that wet area was, vines are dead. So again, not a huge climate difference, not a huge weather difference between here and there, just a little difference in the slope. This is the low spot, standing water. These vines got killed in the winter. These vines up here are totally fine. And I've seen this on multiple sites. 50 feet of difference could be the difference between dead vines and perfectly good vines. So better not to plant these areas at all. Just leave them for drive-through areas, tractor turnaround areas. Just avoid wet feed at all costs. If you have limited problems or limited areas where your water table is coming up or where you have drainage problems, you can ameliorate the soil, you can do tile draining, you can work with the Soil Conservation Service as long as you have a decent transition where you can find a spot, a depth where you can put this perforated tubing, drain the water that's coming in from the top. It drains out, and water that's coming up from the seasonal high water table will be drained out, as long as you have a good slope where you can drain this water away to lower areas. And if you don't have a solid silt layer or a solid clay layer, if you put this in the middle of a solid clay layer or a silt layer, it doesn't absorb the water. You really have to have some transition, as we saw before, from the upper layers of soil, which are drier and have more sand, and the lower layers, which have more clay. So again, the Conservation Service can work well with this, tell you if it works and where to put the the piping. And I have worked with some Eastern Shore wineries that have done this very successfully. Some of these things drain 24/7, 365. You go look at the tube and there's always water running out of them year round. So they can be very effective in draining soils that would be suspect for growing grapes. On the opposite standpoint, we almost always through every summer have some drought. There are times when a grapevine, if overly stressed, we can hurt the grape quality. And of course, during establishment, it's good to have adequate amounts of moisture to get the grapes established. If you were establishing in 18, no problem, plenty of rain. If you were establishing in 19, people had problems because midsummer we had a few weeks of drought which caused the problems. So it is nice to have supplemental irrigation, even if it is only during establishment, whether it's through a well or for bringing it in from a pond, wherever it may be. It may help you for critical times and establishment of the vines, and sometimes if we have extended drought, getting the vines through it, although grapevines are pretty tolerant of dry land production, and they prefer the dry more than the wet within reason. So besides that soil conservation service, we have a site evaluation mapping series that we could do that's GIS and GPS based. I started this in the 2008-2009 with the Maryland Department of Planning. We developed a very simple map with 5 layers, but since then I've been involved with some research in multiple states. So we came up with the initial 5 maps, and then the composite map coded by color for each individual county. This is Washington County, and the darker colors show where the premium sites are for growing grapes. And if you look now where the industry is, this is where Big Cork is, this is Smithsburg with all the orchards there and some of the wineries. So it did match up fairly well. And the state map did again match. This is the better area for growing grapes as far as all the aspects and slopes that we're looking at. We now have a new set of maps. I've been working with Peter Sforza down in Virginia Tech. He developed these maps. We now, instead of having 5 layers, he has, I believe he's up to 28 layers that we can evaluate. The original maps included everything from Maine down to Georgia. Now the only 2 active ones are his in Virginia where he is, and the Maryland Grape Growers and Maryland Wineries Association have gotten a grant from the Governor's Commission to allow Virginia or pay Virginia to open maps up for Maryland. So we can actually use this site, and it's a wonderful, wonderful tool for us to use. Basically, again, it has all the layers, slope, frost-free dates, elevation, aspect, land cover, all these things put together to give you a composite map of your specific site. It's called GeoVine. Again, same thing. You call up GeoVine, you put in your address, you get the overhead view, and you see the only ones active right now are Virginia and Maryland. You put in your address, it gives you an overhead view of your site. You put in the area of interest, and it gives you all the physical features that are critical for us. In your flash drive, I put a copy of this program. It spits out, after you do this, you do your vineyard, you put your site in, you press on the button, and you wait about 3 to 5 minutes, and you get somewhere between a 25 30-page printout of all the critical features: relative elevation, absolute elevation, soil hydrology, all the soil features that you saw in the other ones, and more, land use factors, proximity to sensitive areas, things like that, slope aspect, all these critical things, as well as cultivar recommendations, minimum temperatures that you're dealing with, and their prevalence and their percentages. Lots of critical information here. So either you run this or yourself, or you give me a map of an overhead map of where you plan on putting in your vineyard, and I run it for you and send it. It can be done very, very quickly, and huge amount of information that's very, very helpful for us. Okay, finally figuring out here, getting towards the end, some other site consideration: proximity to wineries where you have to sell the grapes, and also proximity to vineyard pests. And regretfully, in this world, some of the biggest vineyard pests we have can be your neighbors. One of the major problems of grapevines is they're very sensitive to 2,4-D. 2,4-D is an herbicide that's used very commonly in grain crops, and it's basically a hormonal thing where the 2,4-D is a hormone, an auxin-like thing that they spray on the weeds. It grows the weed to death, and they die very quickly. The problem is with grapevines, you even walk in a vineyard and you say 2,4-D, and it starts showing these symptoms. Whoa, hit the button. Grapevines are very sensitive. You know what a normal grape leaf looks like, and that's not it. And this could be so depending on when it happens, it could be completely lethal to the vine. It can kill your crop for the year, or it could just give you short-term damage that the plant grows out of, and it's not a big problem depending on when you get the exposure, how long it is, to what level of the chemical, and when it happens in the developmental or phenological stage of the vine, how it happens. I was in a vineyard where I had my research plots last year. They had an early hit of 2,4-D, wasn't a big deal. Some of our varieties were very sensitive, completely stopped the crop development, and went from having a full crop to the crop never changing, and the berries just stayed pea-sized, never developed. Then there was a mid-season after the crop was getting to full size, there was another hit, and that basically arrested the development and actually killed some of the vines in this vineyard. So it's getting, the good thing here is, of course, know your neighbors. We have something called the Sensitive Crop Program and Sensitive Crop Locator. There's these maps there. You go online with MDA and they're connected to national maps, and you put in where your vineyard site is. So if a chemical, if a company who's putting out agricultural chemicals is spraying around you, they know that you have sensitive crops somewhere there, whether it's grapes or tomatoes or peaches, whatever it may be. Or if you're adjacent to a soybean farm or a grain farmer that is going to spray one of these type chemicals that grapes or tomatoes are sensitive to, they'll be aware that you're there. And there's certain rules as far as the temperature, humidity that they're dealing with, the amount of wind speed, whether they can spray it. So basically it's a matter of communication and knowing where you are. If you're close to the roads, close to a railroad, they do a lot of spraying along those. You can get non-spray areas. You tell the Department of Transportation, and they will mark off areas right around your vineyard, and they will not spray in those areas. So it's communication, communication, communication to avoid this. So 2,4-D is Weed Be Gone. You've probably heard of Weed Be Gone. So if you have neighbors, like residential neighbors, if there's the nice houses with the green lawns up on top of the hill near your vineyard, if you see them out there spraying stuff, it could be Weed Be Gone. Weed Be Gone is 2,4-D. So we've had many, many vineyards having proximity to local houses that came in. The houses came in after, the development came in after the vineyard, but there has been damage. Then there's new genetic engineering that's going on with a lot of the new crops, soybeans and other crops, that they're genetically resistant to 2,4-D and dicamba and other herbicidal type or other hormonal type herbicides. And the crops are bred to be resistant to those. So there's more and more crops coming out that are resistant to 2,4-D and this dicamba. So there will be more use of 2,4-D and dicamba on these crops, which means more problems and more exposure for grapevines. So communicate with all of your neighbors. Let them know that you have grapes. There are chemicals that they can use that are less sensitive, that are less volatile, and the timing is super, super critical. So communication is there. We have some good fact sheets that you can share back and forth yourself with your neighbors, and make sure we minimize this and minimize the exposure that the vines are dealing with. And again, logistics, there's wineries everywhere. If you just growing grapes, try to find a winery that's close to you before you plant the grapes. Find out what grapes they want. If they want a long-term contract with you and what varieties they want you to plant, and interact with them and make that easy. So finally, some take-home considerations here. Site selection could be considered a hazards of macro as well as the meso scale. So know where you are in the big scale, but also the advantages or disadvantages of your individual site, the slope, the aspect, the soil series, the drainage, all those things, the depth to groundwater. Elevation is the single most important vineyard feature in the Mid-Atlantic. A lot impacts length of growing season and frequency of low temperature extremes. Winter survival, which is extremely, extremely important. A little area where on the side of the hill can be very, very critical to grape growing. Make sure you have the best relative elevation of all the areas behind you, because all the areas above you, the cold air will be coming down to you. Soil hydrology, and its water holding capacity and seasonal high water table is perhaps the most important feature of soil. For excessively or very well drained soils, which impacts survival, vine vigor, and fruit quality. And again, the best thing we can do is minimize these risks, knowing that your site, and find to maximize those as possible. Elimination of risk is not realistic. And again, especially in this world of climate change with more extremes, this becomes even more important to have the proper soils and the proper site selection to make sure you minimize the risks that are coming to your vineyard. Okay, we zipped through all those. I know that's a lot of information to cover, but it is a hugely important topic. How many people in here have I run the GeoVine? Have I run the GeoVine for any of you? Okay, so you have an idea. Was it helpful in being able to look at?
It was great, but I didn't. I could never get the function where you could set your weightings and have it come up with the maps that you showed that said like the ideal locations or sites. Could never get that.
Well, in the GeoVine one, it prints it on the following pages. on the Soil Conservation Service, you have to click on the URL there, the color thing, and it'll pop up in the background, depending on which site you're using.
I tried both, but I've used the GeoMine a lot. It comes up with that. The report's great. I just could never get the function to work where it would, you could set your weights. So have it say, okay, this site is, very good versus another. You just have
Okay.
to look at each
All right.
area.
I'll talk with you afterwards, see what we're missing on that. Yes.
I have a question about the weed be gone. So my site is up on a hill, and there's soybean farm much lower downhill. I mean, is that going to be an issue with when carrying it uphill, or protected because of?
In general, yes. If you're better higher than lower, because most of these, but these things volatilize. There's two things you have to worry about. One is the actual overspray of the initial spray. So when he's out there spraying it, the wind can take it and it can drift into that. There's another thing called volatilization, that after it's sprayed and the spray is down and it's on the plant, from 1 to 3 days afterwards, if the temperature and the humidity added together is above 150, so 75 degrees, 75% humidity, that 2,4-D or dicamba can volatilize. So it can change from being liquid form into a more gaseous form, can then get up into the air, get into the wind currents, and can go anywhere, can go miles for all we know. And because it's a hormone, small amounts of this can influence the growth. So I mean, if they're close to you, you're not really safe. You need to communicate with them. Is Dave Myers in here? Dave is going to be talking later about weed management, things like that. He's a huge expert on chemistry of herbicides. He can give you more information on that. So ask him specifically about that, and he can help you with that.
Just to chime in, I've experienced like some of my vineyards where they were like almost a quarter mile away, spray, and they were downhill and spraying. They just burned the whole vineyard.
But yet I know a lot of vineyards that are, one ends right here, here's the fence, 50 feet in are the soybeans and 50 feet in are the grapes, and they live in perfect harmony because they know each other. They know the critical times. They know what, when this guy's going to spray, he knows, if it's early on before the grapes are growing, that's a good thing, get the sprays out of the way. Or if the wind is blowing in the wrong direction, don't spray. If looking at the temperature and humidity over the next 3 days for volatilization, the information is out there. People can coexist very well if they're willing to do it properly. So it's about communication and knowledge. But good questions. Yes?
Quick question. You talked about drain tile and soil. You said also, or the slide said, checking soil to determine whether there's a need for tilling. You didn't mention whether supplementing the soil and tilling in gravel or sand can take care of that sector of a vineyard that looks a little wetter than it should be. How successful is that other than drain tile if you don't have
It's
the soil?
very difficult to add things to soil to make them better drained. The problem is the soils that have problems with drainage, usually it's high clay and high silt contact. We have, and actually, let me see if I have, there are actually these shanks that you can do. Mm-hmm. You can actually go down, and if you have areas where the soil is not draining well, where you're hitting hard clay and the water's not penetrating, you can break through. The problem is you have to have perfect conditions. If the clay is wet or the silt is wet, you go through there and it cuts through it nicely, and guess what? Comes right back and you've done nothing. If it's dry and you can fracture it, yes, you can have some impact, but again, eventually when it gets wet, it will probably come back. So these are short-term.
Drenching kind of down.
If you're going to do anything, what I would recommend if you have a problem would be to get a single shank like this as deep as possible, line out where your grapes are going to be, and shank it as deep as possible to 2+ feet in the area where you're going to grow your grapes, so any water there will go down. But going across back and forth, generally not recommended. The more you disrupt the soil, the worse it's going to be for the soil structure. So you may have a soil that is not well drained, but if you start plowing and doing all the things to it, you'll actually decrease the soil drainage as opposed to increase it. So most of the time, better to deal with what you have if you have to do the tile drain if you find it effective.